Welcome. You're listening to Rabbi Simon Altaf. Now, I've had a question or two, so I've decided to answer the one question that I have for now. There's several questions. One of the questions that came in was, how do we determine truth? How do we know that what you have is truth? Because everybody who has a book claims that my religion, my book is the only truth. So my friends, I'm going to give you a very simple way, logical way of determining truth. First of all, by our own natural logic, I would say, or natural makeup, we know that there cannot be two masters of one house. For instance, you cannot have two kings of one country. We've never seen it in history, having two kings in one country, because there's always a war, one against the other, and one wants to overtake the other before that person becomes a king. Also in the house, where there's two masters, one will fight, one will get out, and the mighty one or the strong one will win. Even in nature, in animal world, what we see is that animals like lions, tigers, leopards, you find that they cannot coexist with another lion sharing the lionesses. There's always going to be one lion and several lionesses. So we see that even in nature, in the animal world, that there's always only one. So therefore, by determining that there's only always one who is a mighty one, and rest will not be always equal stature, we can determine that all religions that claim that there are two or more creators cannot be true. So we have to then determine which religions say that there's only one creator. We know Islam does, we know that Christianity does, we know that Judaism does. So we start looking at these three and narrowing it down. We narrow it down with Islam, and we find that there's a lot of precepts in Islam which are true. Actually, they're not all false. For instance, head coverings, they are actually valid because they come from Judaism or Nazarene Judaism. And we find that they have the idea of washing the hands and feet. True, because it comes from the Bible. You are meant to wash your hands and feet when you go and study and read the Bible. This is given in the books of the Torah. And we also find this given in the New Testament books. We find that we go further, and we find that Judaism has, for instance, Christianity. We go back to Christianity and we find that they have truths as well. For instance, they have the idea that salvation is only through one person called Jesus, but we know that his name wasn't Jesus, because that name you cannot find in the 4th century. That name you'll only find 500 years ago, because there was no J in the English language. So therefore the name we find in the 1st century is not Jesus, but Yehoshua. Yehoshua means Yahweh, who is salvation. So therefore when we look at that, we then determine that yes, there is a way of determining truth, and then we go back to the prophets, because both Islam and Christianity both claim to believe in the prophets. Well, let's go and see what the prophets tell us. So we go to the prophets, my friends, and we find in, for instance, Isaiah chapter 53 talks about the suffering servant. I know that a lot of Jewish people will say that the suffering servant is Israel. Technically, yes, to a certain extent, but not true completely, because it's a singular person. It can apply to Israel as a nation, but it cannot apply to the singular person who is being will die, who will raise, and whose seed the generations will extend. Because we know that Israel may have a technical allegory to it, but Israel isn't the de facto person, because it says that this person bore the sins of many in Isaiah chapter 53. We know that Israel does not bear the sins of many today, because if you want to have a look at Hamas and look at the current war. Is Israel bearing the sin of many? Is Israel taking the beating from Hamas? No. They've gone in for a war. They are fighting for rights. Israel has always fought for their rights. We do not find that they have taken my sin upon themselves or your sin upon themselves. But we do find that there is a person by the name of Yehoshua who did take the sins of the world or sins of Israel upon himself to free us from sin and death. Then we find that if we start looking at that one person, we find in Nazarene Judaism that did Christianity of late or Islam follow that very faith the same way? We find no. We find that 4th century Christianity is different. We find that 7th century Islam is different. We find that both are modified, because we find that the way that the first disciples of Yehoshua believed and walked in the faith, the 4th century Christians did not. We find that the Christians who were true, the believers who were true to their faith, they actually went underground, because Constantine in the 4th century put an edict out saying that anybody who keeps the Sabbath, anybody who keeps the Jewish feasts will be put to the prisons and will be persecuted. And so therefore, my friends, we very easily, even through nature and logic, can determine where truth is. We find truth in the Bible for sure, but then we have to find how to keep truth. And then we find that Yehoshua himself tells us time and time again, he says, I am the way. Where does he get the idea of I am the way? That comes from the book of Deuteronomy by Moses' own mouth, because Moses said Yahweh was the way, because Yahweh declares in there he is the way. We find also going forward, where Yehoshua says, I am the life, HaChaim. Where do we find I am the life? Well, we go back to the first chapter of Genesis. We find Yahweh is putting life into Adam, and he's saying he is the life. So therefore, life is in Yahweh. Then we find he says that for instance, I am the truth. Now we know that the truth is idiomatic expression in Hebrew language for keeping Torah. So therefore, Yehoshua, we know by definition kept Torah, and his disciples did. But we find that this situation broke from 4th century or from 90 AD onwards from Saint Ignatius, because Saint Ignatius changed the day from Saturday worship to Sunday. And then Constantine in the 4th century endorsed it, saying that this is a valid day for us. We no longer want to keep the Sabbath from Friday sunset to Saturday sunset. So therefore things were changed, things were modified. Even today things were added, things were removed. Whereas Yahweh in Deuteronomy chapter 4 verse 2 tells us, you cannot add, you cannot remove from my word. Both Christianity, I'm sad to say, Islam and all the other faiths that claim to be monotheistic, like for instance Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, they have all added and removed. Whilst the word of Yahweh, that is the Bible, has never been changed, and we can always go back to the 1st century model, and we can see that truth has always been established by the 1st century disciples, and thereafter first 15 bishops of Jerusalem were Jewish. They were keeping the feasts, they were keeping the Sabbath, they were circumcising their children and teaching everybody to do likewise. Do you find that in churches today? No, you don't find that in churches today. In fact, Nazarene Judaism or Nazarene people are very few and minority, but Yahweh is bringing them back. Yahweh is turning people around, and Yahweh is building up his congregation, because the Messiah Yehoshua, our bridegroom, is coming back soon. So therefore we are building up, we are regrouping, we are trying to understand our faith, our roots. We're going back to our roots to keeping Torah, because if you don't keep Torah, you're in a very precarious position. I'm afraid that salvation is one thing, but there are many other factors to it. For instance, what happens when you enter the kingdom? What position do you have? Do you become a slave or do you become a master? These are positions in the kingdom. And also you find that which resurrection do you have? Do you get the first resurrection for the believers, the disciples, or do you get the second resurrection because you were disobedient? So these are factors, my brothers and sisters, that are very valid, that are very important, and I feel that I need to tell you and warn you that if you do not keep the word as Yehoshua taught us to keep it, I wouldn't say that you stand of judgment or hellfire, because if you claim the blood of Yehoshua, fine, well and good, but if you do not obey his commandments, tough luck for you, my friend, because you're going to have trouble in the kingdom. So I'm going to end it here, and I'm going to tell you, keep the faith, believe in Yehoshua as a Messiah, that his blood covers our sins and removes it completely, and keep the Torah, stay in the faith. Bless you. Shalom, shalom.